today's lesson will be about. Today's lesson is going to be about emotions. Now, we all start with a primary set, and as we grow older, we acquire more of them.
When your emotions control your action, it affects not only yourself, but the people around you.
This will help. Sit down. Emotions are centered in the lower part of the brain.
It is complicated, yes, but mysterious no longer.
Emotional behavior is largely involuntary.
I can't believe that.
We have certain basic emotions which are controlled subconsciously. Notice your own emotional reactions. What did you feel? What did you do?
Under control, your emotions can make you healthier and happier and improve the lives of people around you.
This is pretty clever.
That's a rather simplified suggestion of a complex mental process, but you get the idea.
We're finishing today our sermon series on emotions, and we've been talking about how difficult it is to live the life of celebration and joy and worship with God that He intends for us if we don't have control of our emotions. Our emotions can sweep us from one extreme to the other very quickly if we don't have control over them. And we've talked about emotions such as sorrow, and we've talked about being afraid, we've talked about anger, and we talked last week about the problem of not having any emotions at all. And really that is a problem. God gave us emotions for a reason. Today we're going to finish talking about willpower, how to harness the will, because your will is going to play a part in your emotional configuration. It's going to play a part in restraining, controlling, and directing your emotions. The problem is it's not the part that most of us think. How many of you guys have ever tried to say, I'm going to be more patient, I'm going to be less angry, and you tried really hard to do it? How did that work out? How many of you guys experienced a little bit less success than you wanted to when you did that? Right? The problem is that sometimes it actually makes it even worse. I don't know about you guys, but sometimes when I'm trying really hard to be patient, I find that I'm even less patient. And so we need to figure out why that is. And we're going to look today at 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7. And it's a very short passage. It's very direct and straightforward. It says this, it says in 1 Timothy 4:7, have nothing to do with an irreverent, silly myths, rather train yourself for godliness. And really what this passage is about, it's about the fact that there's always all kinds of new ideas, new things to do. There's always these ways of doing something for nothing, of getting rich quick, of taking a pill or doing something and all of a sudden finding yourself super in shape. Those things tend to not work at all. The truth is that what tends to work is training ourselves. Now, the problem is that there's some upsides and downsides to this, and we're going to see that in a minute. But as we go through this passage today, we're going to look at three things that we need to really grab a hold of and understand. The first one we're going to talk about is willpower applied. How do you apply your willpower in a way that is helpful and makes sense? The second thing we're going to talk about is identity defined, because who you are is going to be a big part of getting control of your emotions. And then lastly, we're going to talk about greatestness pursued. Now, it's not greatness pursued. It's greatestness pursued. There's a distinction, there's a difference there. They don't really have that word, so I had to make it up. But after you hear this sermon, you're going to be like, they should have that word. And I'm going to agree with you wholeheartedly. So how do we look at this? How do we have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths? How do we train ourselves in godliness? Or how do we, number one, apply our willpower to the problem of our emotions? There's some great things about willpower. One of the things that's really fascinating about willpower is it operates independently from a lot of your other cognitive functions. Now, this is really strange. They used to think of willpower or habit forming, they used to think about this as just part of your memory. And so basically, if you wanted to form a new habit, if you wanted to apply your will to controlling your emotions over time, and what that results in is creating habits. If you wanted to do that, they figured that basically what you were doing is just remembering what you should do. And what happened is in the 2000s, they realized that hypothesis was completely wrong. And the reason they realized that is because a guy named Eugene suffered a very traumatic brain problem in which he lost his memory. And not only did he lose his memory, but he lost the ability to make new memories. Think about how terrible that would be. If he met you, and he met you the next day, or even about 10 or 15 minutes later, he would not remember that he knew you. And that went for everybody in his life. He lived in a house that was being paid for him. He lived in this house that was always a complete mystery to him. If you asked him, where is the living room, or where is the dining room, or where is the bathroom, he was completely befuddled. He couldn't tell you. What they found was really interesting, though, is that after a short time in the house, even though he couldn't tell you where the bathroom is, when he needed to go to the bathroom, he would actually go to the right room. And if you asked him, well, why did you come to this room? He'd say, I don't know. He was completely baffled by the fact that he went to the right room. And in fact, what they started to do was they started playing memory games with him. And over time, what they realized is he knew the answers of how to play these games. But if you asked him to explain it, he couldn't. And yet, if he just did it, he could follow through. And you would ask him, well, how did you know? How did you know the right answer? Well, he'd say, I don't know. I guess I'm just lucky. That was his answer all the time. He didn't realize that he gave that answer all the time because he forgot. But one of the things that was most fascinating about him is that they actually started letting him go on walks. And he would go around the block and come home. And if at any point during the walk you asked him, well, how do you get home from here? He'd say, I don't know. And yet he would go there. One time he disappeared. They couldn't find him. And what had happened is a construction crew was doing some work on the sidewalk and he couldn't go the way he normally go, and then he got completely lost. And what they eventually discovered is that he was forming new habits even though he couldn't form new memories. And the reason for that is that the part of your brain that is associated with willpower and creating new habits is actually not associated with your memory. And so it's a fascinating part of your brain that God has made for you. And one of the things that they've discovered about this part of your brain is that when you establish habits by asserting your will, you actually make your life easier. Now, it's harder while you're establishing the habit, but once the habit is established, your life is actually easier. Now, think about this. How many of you, remember the very first time you got behind the wheel of a car and remembered how overwhelming it was? Anyone? You remember like being completely overwhelmed, like there's so many things to remember and think about. And when you came here this morning, you weren't like that. Why? In fact, sometimes, have you ever gotten somewhere and you don't remember going there at all? Like you got in the car and you were thinking about something else and you arrived someplace and you think, holy cow, I don't remember any part of this. I don't remember if I ran over pedestrians. I don't remember if I ran every red light. Somehow I'm here and I don't see anybody draped over the hood of my car, so it must have gone okay. It's because your brain has turned over all of that to the part of your brain that deals with habits, and it's just run the program. And what that's allowed your brain to do, because it's offloaded all of the driving to this other part, it frees up the part of your conscious brain to actually do all kinds of stuff. You can think, you can have conversations, you can plan your future, you can do all that, and you arrive at church and go, oh, I'm here. And what we find is that when we create good habits, that it makes it easier for us to control ourselves. It makes it easier for us to respond to things if you create good habits. Now, you might say then, knowing this about the will, here is the answer to my problems. Here is what is I'm going to create good habits of harnessing my emotions and using them in the appropriate way. I'm going to do that, and this will be the answer to my problems. What you will find, though, is that you will be frustrated in this endeavor. In our Sunday school class, we were talking this morning about God's covenants with man, and how at Sinai he had a covenant where all the Israelites were vowing to be faithful to God, and that really what you read in the book of Judges is they completely messed that up. By the end of the book of Judges, it is a complete horror show going on in Israel, and they cry out for a king, and God says, okay, I'll give you a king. Now, what most people don't understand is that this arrangement is a completely different arrangement, and there's a new covenant that gets made, and that covenant is that this king represents you people, and so if he's faithful, that's credited to you, but if he's sinful, that's counted against you. And all that is a foreshadowing of Christ, who will be our king, where God will look at Christ and look at his perfection and look at his righteousness and will allow us to claim that for ourselves because we have made him our king. The problem is, though, this, that in the Old Testament, in this foreshadowing, it foreshadows the idea of having this champion, this king that will stand up for you, but it also shows something else, that human willpower is completely flawed, and none of the kings, no matter whether it's David or Solomon or the rest of them, none of them do it well. They're all a mess. Why? Because willpower has severe limitations. The problem is that you can't turn everything over to the subroutine. You can't just push the button and run the program and let it live your life. That's not how it works. And in fact, creating new habits is very intensive, and while you're creating new habits, you're exercising so much willpower that you lessen your willpower in all the other aspects of your life. How many of you guys have ever experienced this? You're like, I really need to get things done at work, and so you really focus on work. What happens to the rest of your life? It becomes a shambles, doesn't it? You're all of a sudden, your exercise regime is gone. You know what I'm saying? Like, the problem is that there's just not enough willpower to go around. You can't just turn over your life to willpower. So what's the answer? Well, the Bible, interestingly enough, talks about something much different. It talks about walking or living by the Spirit. In Galatians chapter 5:16, it says, "But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh." Now, having read that verse, you might see a contradiction here. I hope you see that. 1 Timothy 4:7 says, train yourself for godliness. Training, willpower, work hard. And then this verse says, nah, you're going to mess it up. I say, walk by the Spirit, you will not gratify the desires of the... Well, what's going on? What's going on is this. This is confusing advice, whether you should train or not train or walk by the Spirit. What does this mean? It means that you're going to train, but you're not going to train yourself the way you think. You're not going to train yourself in the area that you think you are. You might think to yourself, well, I'm going to train in all these different areas of my life. I'm going to train to be more patient. I'm going to train to control my anger. I'm going to train to be more joyful. I'm going to train to do all this stuff. You know what's going to happen? If you try to do that, there will not be enough willpower to go to all of those things at once. You need to train, but you need to train on one thing. And that one thing you need to train on is walking by the Spirit. You have enough willpower to train for one thing, so train for this thing. Walk by the Spirit. What does that mean? You'll find all kinds of people who will also say all kinds of things about what it means to walk by the Spirit. But I think that it's actually a lot more simple and straightforward than we sometimes make it. The Bible recognizes two different spheres or areas of life, the flesh and the Spirit. The flesh is what things seem to be. Right? Somebody walks into this room and I say, what do you see here? And he says, I see bags of flesh. Well, that's not a very generous way of saying it, right? I see collections of human DNA everywhere. Well, you can't really argue with that, right? I mean, it's pretty much the way that it is. That's what you might say we're made out of, but is that what we are? You see, the problem is, from the biblical standpoint, the ancient world, there's two realms. There's the physical side, and then there's the spiritual side. And the spiritual side is all those things that give life meaning and value and purpose, but they don't exist in physical form. Like, here's the thing that's really interesting. I was talking to somebody a couple weeks ago, and he was saying that he's driven by this church for like 20 years. And he's seen it almost every day for 20 years. And he said, finally I said, well, why don't I go in? And he's a great guy. I mean, we had a great conversation. He's a really wonderful man. Now, here's the thing. Some of you guys have seen this church for 20 years, and you've seen it on the inside. And I'll tell you that if you drive by this church for 20 years, you're seeing the same church that you guys see if you've attended here for 20 years. But I can tell you that even though you're looking at the same building, you're not really looking at the same church. You guys know what I'm saying, right? It's not the same thing. Because what it's come to mean to you over 20 years is so much different than what it's come to mean to somebody else as he's passed by for 20 years. Now, maybe he'll start to attend here, and in 20 years from now, it'll mean something completely different. Have you guys ever noticed that? Maybe you work with a coworker for 2 or 3 years, and you don't know them, and then all of a sudden, you're thrust into a work group together, and you get to know that person, and now they mean something completely different to you than they did before. It's the difference between walking by sight and walking by faith. It's the difference between walking in the Spirit and walking in the flesh. There is what things seem to be according to our flesh, but then there's what things are according to the Spirit. And the question is, which one will control your life? Which one will control your life? And that's not a small thing to grapple with. Here's the thing. How many of you guys ever heard that story about Abraham Lincoln, about all the things that he failed in his life? Can you imagine? And I'm not going to recite it all right now. First of all, because I couldn't. It would be another one of those stories where I give you a lot of vague details, and then at the end, it's just kind of not there. But you guys remember he failed at so many things. He failed in business, and he failed in political runs, and he failed at so many things. And yet, when we say the name Abraham Lincoln, all of us think of something that is probably not even close to all those failures. But imagine if right before he won the presidency, you were to walk up to Abraham Lincoln and say, "Who are you? What are you? Tell me, give me a sentence that says what you are." What would he say? Would he say, "Man, I'm nothing but a failure? I failed at every single thing in my life. I am literally..." Because that's the thing, is that a lot of us would say that, right? A lot of us would maybe look at our own lives, and what sticks out to us is our failures. And we say, if somebody walked up to us and say, let's cut through all the garbage here. Let's really be honest with each other. Let's get into what's really inside of us. Who are you? Would you say, "I'm nothing but a failure. I'm pretty, really, when I think about it, I'm pretty worthless"? I think a lot of us would actually say that. We would say, really when it gets down to it, what's inside of us? Who am I? That's what I am. No, that's what you look like, maybe. But here's the thing. If you think about Abraham Lincoln, what would he say after he won the presidency? He would have a different answer, right? Here's the thing. If you are who God says you are, and Christ really has done for you what He says He's done, what it looks like maybe up to and including the minute of your death is a completely different answer than what it will be a minute after your death. You can literally fail at every single thing in your life up to and including the point of your death. You might die the stupidest death in the history of the world. You might. Somebody's going to. It could be any one of us. Hopefully not in this room, but you never know. There are times in my life I think I might be angling for that. But you might somebody might look back over every moment of their life and say that person was nothing but a failure. But the thing is, if Christ died for you and you have trusted in Him, then the minute after your death, your life will look completely different than it did before. Everything in your life was just preparation. You can look at Abraham Lincoln's life and say everything in his life was preparation, and that's why he won as president. And you might say the same thing about your life. In the end, it doesn't matter if I was successful here on earth. If I have faith in Jesus Christ, then maybe every single failure of my life has been getting me to the point where I am the kind of person who can be joyful in heaven. And so looking back at my life, it doesn't matter that I failed at everything, because really, what is earthly success anyway? And so in the end, that's what matters. See, here's what I'm talking about. Is it true or isn't it? And what does your life mean? And what does it mean to be a child of God? And what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean that God created you as a human being, made in His image, to be a priest and king? What does it mean that Christ died for you and that Christ saved you? What does it mean? You're either living by what you look like from the outside, oh, I'm just a human being and who knows what that is, or you're living what God has said you are. And the thing is, you can say, well, that sounds like maybe a lot of religious hocus pocus. I assure you, it is not. Because there are children all over this world who grow up with parents who treat them merely as biological issues. And then there are children who grow up being extraordinarily loved as children. And I can tell you that it makes a difference how you grew up. In fact, there might not be anything that makes more of a difference to you. The biological aspect is there in both of them, but is that really what it means to be a parent? Is that really what it means to be a child? Do you want to live by the person who's walking by the flesh? Or do you want to be the child of the person that's walking by the Spirit, that gets up every day and says, I am a father, I am a mother, and that has meaning because God made it have meaning, and this person is my child, and that has meaning, and I'm going to live that way. When you focus your will on walking by the Spirit and living your life in the way that God created you, saying, I'm not going to live my life as if I'm merely what I appear to be, but I'm going to live my life according to what God says I am, then the first thing that happens is you discover a new identity. So let's look secondly at identity defined. Who is God? God can mean a whole bunch of things to a whole bunch of people. It can be something that's just a spiritual force that's kind of undefined. It can be a deist God who sets the world in motion and then says, see ya. It can be a whole bunch of things. What's the identity of God? Is He somebody that created you in His image, that has created you to be a priest and a king, who when you failed, loved you so much that He sent His Son to die for you? You see, what you believe about God and your creation will determine what you believe about yourself and your identity. What you believe about God creates who you are. And this makes a huge difference. Are you a child of God? Ephesians chapter 1, verse 17 and 18 says that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give you the spirit of wisdom and of revelation in the knowledge of Him, having the eyes of your hearts enlightened, that you may know what is the hope to which He has called you, what are the riches of His glorious inheritance in the saints. I want to focus on that last phrase. What are the riches of His glorious inheritance in the saints? There is a glorious inheritance that's available to every one who accepts Christ. Because what happens when you accept Christ is because Christ is the Son of God, and then you make Him your king, your champion. You say, I'm going to be found in Him, then that means then you get adopted as sons of God. And when you're a son of God, then all these riches are available to you. Imagine getting adopted by the wealthiest family in the entire world. Would you get an inheritance? Yeah, even if they left you nothing, if you got to spend time with them, if you got to live with them, you know what I'm saying? Like there would be so much you would learn and so much that would be yours as part of that. Well, what happens is that when you believe what God has said, when you live according to the Spirit, then the first thing it changes is your identity. And that makes everything different in your life. There is a glorious inheritance with you. And you say, well, what do I get? I don't know. It depends on It depends on what you see. It depends on your faith. Some people get nothing and some people get everything. Because what happens with some people is they look at who Jesus is and they look at the glory that He has and they say, I am a son of God. I am a daughter of God through Jesus Christ. And that means that I am to resemble my Father. And if He has every glorious thing possible, if God is the definition of glory, if you look at the word hope, there's God. If you look at the word love, there's God. If you look at the word faithfulness, there's God. If you look at, you know what I say? He is the most of everything, and I am to resemble Him. And those are the things that have real value and worth. Then you all of a sudden have this identity in Him, and all of a sudden now that glory is conferred to you. You have every riches, every imaginable article of wealth that is given to you. You resemble His glory, and there's nothing better than that. And you say, well, what about money? A piece of paper with some words printed on it. That's what you want instead? I mean, think about it. What would you rather have? A bunch of pieces of paper with words printed on it? Or would you rather be glorious? Your life becomes defined in relation to Him. And when your life becomes defined in relation to Him, then everything in your life changes. So why is it important? Why is your identity important? Think about it this way. How many of you have ever run in your life? Ever in your life? You ran. You ran somewhere. Okay, good. It's most of us. How many of you would call yourself a runner? None of us. Okay. Good. I'm among friends. I'm not a runner either. Now, here's the thing. I have run in my life. Now, the only time I can imagine myself running if something seriously terrible is chasing me. Outside of that, I'm just not doing it. I'm not running. Okay? Now, here's the thing. I don't consider myself a runner. But if I did consider myself a runner, what would change? Well, everything about running, right? Everything about running. Now, here's the thing. Some of us have run, but none of us are runners. Your identity means a lot to your activity. Your identity means a lot to your activity. Now, here's the thing. You might say today, right now, I might inspire you with all my wonderful tales of running, and you might say, hey, I heard something great in the sermon today. I'm going to be a runner. How much running do you have to do before you're a runner? Is there an amount? Not really, is there? There really isn't an amount. So here's the thing that's weird about this, is there really isn't an amount. What's important is a mindset, right? It's important. You say, I'm a runner. And what that means generally is that you're orienting your life around running. That's what it means to be a runner. So here's the problem that we encounter as Christians. How many of you are sons and daughter of God Most High? Sons and daughters of God Most High. How many of us are Christians? We have the name of Christ. We bear the name of Christ. And if somebody asks you, say, I'm a Christian, well, it's kind of like being a runner. There's not necessarily a certain number of good acts you need to have done. Here's the thing. Your life needs to be oriented around that truth. If your life is not oriented around that truth, then you're really not that thing. You see, I can be, and I have been in the past. There was a time at which I did a fair amount of running in my life, but I never considered myself a runner. Why? Because the only time anything in my life was oriented around running was the moment that I was running. But see, if you're really a runner, then everything in your life is oriented around running. You know what you do? You eat differently. You sleep differently. You read things differently. You look for different things. You spend your time, right? You orient yourself. You say, like all of your time is spent, well, how can I be a better runner? How can I do this? How can I do that? How can I do this? And even if you're not running, your life is oriented around it. Here's the problem that we have to grapple with, is that most of us will try to control our emotions. And we will fail. And the reason that we'll fail is because number one, our efforts are not in the right direction. Your emotions will be controlled if you live by the Spirit, and that's where your identity comes from. But secondly, most of us will fail because it's the lowest commitment option. Here's the thing. Let's say this. Let's say I'm going to try to run a marathon. And so I go out and I say, hey, it's the day of the marathon. And somebody's like, how long have you been training for this? And I just woke up this morning and decided to do it. What would they say to me? They would say, good luck. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. I'm going to try really hard. And they're like, oh, why didn't you say that? Now, see, when we say we're trying something, it's like the lowest commitment option, right? It's not an identity. It's just something that we, spur of the moment, we decided, outside of the moment we're doing it, we have put nothing into it. Nothing's been sacrificed for it. But see, when you walk by the Spirit and it changes your identity, what that means is that means that you're training. Now, you might not use that word training, and it's not important that you use that word. What happens is everything in your life starts orienting around this, and this is how your emotions start to come out under control. You want to be more patient? If you go out and try to be more patient, you're going to fail, I guarantee you, and most of us have done that before, and we failed. I'm telling you that's not going to work. What you have to do is discipline yourself to take in the truth of God about who you are, to live like who God has told you you are, and then your identity will become something different. You will orient your life around something different, and the end goal or the end byproduct of that will be that your life will be transformed. You see, if you were doing anything else, if you were really committed to anything else, you would go through these steps and not realize that that's what you were doing. You would say to yourself, I've got to surround myself with the truth of things. That I can do this, that I can become a runner, that I can run a marathon. And I'm going to orient my life. I'm going to start eating better food because I need to drop a few pounds because I can't carry this 26 miles. And then you would say, I need to orient, I need to find out a schedule. I need to, you know what I'm saying? I need to work on better sleep. I need to work, and everything in your life. See, this is what you would do if you were really serious about anything in your life. And I'm telling you, it's the same thing here, that you have to first step, apply your willpower to walking in the Spirit. What does that mean? That means that some things about your life need to change. You need to especially change what you're telling yourself and what you're allowing yourself to be told about who you are and about who everybody else is. About who God is and who you are and who all the people around you are. That has to change. You can't keep thinking the same way about that. Well, thirdly, let's talk about greatestness pursued. Now, here's the problem. I thought about talking about greatness pursued, but the problem is I'm not interested in greatness. You might say, that's obvious. No, I'm interested in the greatest. Great is okay. I mean, it's great. But greatest, well, that's the greatest. So, we want to talk about greatestness pursued. How do you become the greatest? Through greatestness and by pursuing it. So we need to live by the Spirit or walk by the Spirit. You know, the interesting thing is when you do that, it does something else to you besides giving you a new identity. So it's going to give you a new identity. You're going to walk by the Spirit. You're going to listen to what God is saying to you. You're going to do that through prayer. You're going to do that through meditation. You're going to do that through scripture reading. You're going to do that through worship. You're going to do that by soaking in what God is saying and starting to see things the way that He tells you they are and not the way that they appear to be. And then what's going to happen is you're going to start acting like that. But along with training, along with this whole idea that we've been talking about of training and your identity being defined, what's going to happen is that your goals are going to be refined. What happens is that your life and the direction of your life gets pointed somewhere else. You're going to choose between what you want now versus what you want ultimately. See, the problem is this. Let's say you're training to be a marathon runner. Your goal is not to run the marathon, but to win the marathon. And then you see a piece of cake. And you think, do I really want to win a marathon? That cake looks pretty good. And then somebody goes, oh, I have ice cream to go with it. And you're like, ooh, ice cream and chocolate cake. Is there anything better than that? So what's happening is there's a struggle. There's a struggle between what you want now and what you want ultimately. You know what that struggle really is? That struggle is between the flesh and the spirit. And here's the interesting thing. If you have no spiritual goals, there is nothing to compete with that fleshly desire. Do you understand what I'm saying by that? If you have no spiritual goals, there is nothing to compete with that fleshly desire. Your flesh sees the cake and it wants the cake. Why? God's programmed you that way. Why? Because it's good. Here's what I mean. Think about thousands and thousands of years of humans barely clinging to life. Have you noticed a squirrel, a dog, a cat, anything? If you put enough food in front of it, what does it do? It eats as much as it can possibly eat. Often too much. Why? Because God made it that way. God made animals for survival in the worst possible conditions. Because if He made us to survive in the best possible conditions, as soon as the conditions were the worst possible, we'd all be dead. And so just like any animal, when you see some good food there, not only do you say, I want to eat that, but you say, I want to eat as much of that as I can possibly stomach. And sometimes that's a lot, right? But think about it. That's the way. So there you have these fleshly desires. You know what? You have a fleshly desire to eat. You have a fleshly desire to sleep because sleeping conserves energy. You have the fleshly desire to procreate. Why? Because if you didn't, well, none of us would be here. You have all these fleshly desires. And if you have no spiritual goals in your life, no spiritual hierarchy, something that says this is worth more than that, then there's nothing to compete with those fleshly desires. And you will have the life of an animal, and you will find it completely unsatisfying. In fact, there will be nothing less satisfying in your life than living it. That's the way that it works. And so what happens is when you walk by the Spirit, not only does your identity change, but your goals change. The hierarchy of values changes. You say, you know what? There's a part of my flesh that wants to eat all that cake, but I've decided that there's glory out there to be had in something else. And so I'm going to put that off and I'm going to focus on that. Now here's the thing. The stronger those spiritual goals and desires are for you, the easier it will be to make that decision every time. You know what? There's all kinds of people in this world who have dedicated themselves to skiing, to running, to doing all those things. And you put a piece of cake in front of them, it means nothing to them. In fact, it's kind of offensive and gross. And like, that disgusts me because that equals not getting where I want to go. So I don't even want to look at that. Why? Because they have pursued that goal so strongly in their life for so long that doesn't matter anymore. The problem is that most of us say to ourselves, well, I'll just not eat the cake. And you know what? It doesn't work because the more you're thinking about not eating the cake, you know what word is bolded in that sentence? Cake. I won't eat that cake. I'm not going to look at that cake. I'm going to walk by that cake. Maybe I'll have just a little bit of that cake. Oh, I ate that whole cake. And that's what you'll do because the thing is you don't have something else to replace it. You don't have something that is greater, that is more glorious, that means more to you. And so what happens is when you walk by the Spirit, your orientation, your goals, what you're pursuing changes. You don't want to be great. You want what is greatest. And everything else is just a step away from your ultimate goal. You're saying, I'm going this direction, everything else is a step in the wrong direction. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, it says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising its shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus was after the joy of his Father. And he endured all kinds of hardships. Why? Because comfort wasn't his goal. Popularity wasn't his goal. Ease wasn't his goal. He had a spiritual goal, and that was being the greatest. Being seated with the greatest. Being in union with the greatest. Our God is the greatest thing that exists. He is the greatest person who exists. And He has called us into a covenant with Himself where He shares His greatness with us. That should be our goal. And everything else is just the opposite direction. Nothing else matters except for being able to achieve what is grace. Why would I want something like sin in my life when I can have the glory of God? But it only works when we walk by the Spirit and we train ourselves in that. So how do we apply this? Well, believe in God's glory. How do you do that? You meditate and you study the glory of God. If you're not doing that in your life on a regular basis, then you're not going to be finding it very easy to walk in the Spirit, because there's conflicting voices all around you about what the world is about, what's really good, what's really fun, what's really great, what's really a great life. You're going to look at those things. You have to be studying about the glory, meditating on the glory of God. You have to belong to Him through a covenant and share His glory. And the best way of doing that is through worship. Do you worship at home? Do you worship when you're by yourself? Do you have a time where you say, I'm going to worship God? I'm just going to think and express with my life the glory of who He is. And then finally become glorious by being transformed to His goal of glory for you. We walk by the Spirit so that we can reach the goal. Now notice it's interesting. It's walking by the Spirit. And even though it's a race, it's still walking. Why? Because progress is slow. That's just the nature of life. The nature of life is progress is slow. Don't think to yourself, well, I'm making such little progress, I might as well give up. No. You have your entire life. And there's going to be times when you don't know what to do. There's going to be times when you're not sure where to go next. But then those times end and God shows us what we need to do with our lives. So this week, think about your life and what you really want it to look like. And that should be informed by what God says He is, who God says He is, what He said He's done for you, and who you are. What is the greatest life you can imagine in light of those things? And how will you get there? If you're never thinking this way, and you're gonna, the first time you come up with this, it's gonna be wrong. You still need to do it, because you're never gonna be right if you're never wrong. Have you ever noticed that if you ever want to do anything, you have to be bad at it before you're good at it? And if you're not willing to be bad at it, you'll never get good at it. If you want to be a runner, you're going to be a bad runner before you're a good runner. If you want to be a painter, you're going to be a bad painter before you're a good painter. If you want to walk by the Spirit, you're going to be bad at it before you're good at it. But that badness is on the road. You're making progress. You're farther than you were. Think about where you want your life to go. Draw it out. Write it out. This is what I think my life can look like. If I'm really resembling the glory of God in my life and the circumstances that He's put me, this is what I think it can look like. And start heading that direction. And as you go down the road, God's Spirit will be a light to your path. And then you'll see a little bit farther and a little bit farther, and it'll get more refined and it'll get more refined. But that's the way that it works. We have an awesome opportunity to be united to the greatest. Let's discipline ourselves to reach that goal.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.